you also vote with your money, right? And we might feel that, oh, I'm just a pleb, I'm barely scraping by. Maybe I'm in debt. Like, how could I possibly, have any votes with my money? But you do, right? And there's so many of us in the Bitcoin space that are struggling, that are in debt, but we're siphoning whatever energy that we have into a system that makes it impossible for them to dilute the food, to start endless wars, to manipulate people with lobbying. There's so many things that you cannot do in the existing system that we don't like in the Bitcoin system. And so your vote is put money into the Bitcoin system, hold Bitcoin. People don't realize how powerful of a vote that is. And it seems small, but the world is moving towards putting as much capital as possible into that system. And if you do it now, you get a vote that weighs more than your vote in the future because the price of Bitcoin will likely go up. Money is your second vote, right? And if you don't allocate it properly or you waste it, you're wasting your vote. It's as simple as that.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls. Thank you for coming back for another episode of the podcast. We have a wonderful Bitcoin content creator out here, a guy who is carrying the TikTok team on his back, as far as I've seen. Uh, Getting that good video content out there, teaching people about Bitcoin, doing a lot of traveling, being a part of a lot of cool projects. And Julian Figueroa. I hope I pronounced that last name
You
correctly.
got
Is
it. You
that
nailed
right?
it. You nailed
Yes.
it.
AKA Kinetic Finance. Thank you so much for joining me today, sir.
Thanks for having me, Ben. Appreciate it.
My first question is, why is your shirt not off, enjoying the sunshine right now?
Because I'm in Vancouver and my body is still in recovery after all the shenanigans that I've been up to lately. So,
I'll give you the Pacific Northwest pass. Does Vancouver count as Pacific Northwest? Do you
oh, for
guys
sure, for
consider Canada
sure.
part of that?
You
I
know,
don't know
I
if
do realize though, after the pandemic, I started exploring a lot more of Washington State, and by God, did they give you guys the better chunk when they did the parallel, 49th parallel or whatever? Because we have nothing. Like you can drive from the border of Canada and the US, maybe 100 kilometers before you just get to completely untenable circumstances. Like there's no real beaches really on the Pacific Northwest side. You can go up just a little bit, you get, Tawasin and then maybe a little bit Sunshine Coast. But as soon as you start going past that, you're just in the middle of the boonies. It's completely uninhabited. Meanwhile, you go down to Washington, you just got beaches and beaches and beaches, just endless. You can walk on them for, 3, 4 days. And I'm jealous.
I
But
would argue the
thankfully,
beaches
they let me cross the border there pretty frequently. So,
the beaches get even better as you go south, in my opinion. So I've spent
oh,
so
yeah,
much
in
time
Oregon.
across the whole West Coast. I was born in Oregon, spent most of my life in Washington, so I've done just millions of road trips between the two, and several down to California as well. And man, just Northern California to Oregon, I think is really just the beach zone where you have so many beaches. A lot of them are just not inhabited. They're really quite empty and just you have most of it to yourself because there's just so much of it. The entire coast is beach, so if you just stay away from the cities, you pretty much get open territory. And I have so many beautiful memories of just taking a skimboard in the car. We would go down road trips, and I'd just go skimboarding, and my parents would hang out and just read their newspaper, and I would just like run all over the place and just have the whole beach to ourselves. It's awesome.
It's
And
wild. I love the Oregon coast. We got some quads and did dune buggying in Florence, and it's amazing.
oh, nice. I
Yeah.
will say though, the west coast of Canada, I did a motorcycle trip with my dad up to Alaska from
Oh, cool.
Seattle. And it was like during the autumn, so all the leaves were changing colors. It was gorgeous. There are some beautiful sights to be seen. It's just a very different type of
Yeah.
terrain for sure.
Well, you're going inland though. When you're going up to Alaska, you're kind of going a little bit inland, and then I think if you want to go to Juneau or whatever it's called, then you end up going back to the coast. But
We went to Hyder. We pretty much just got to the tip of Alaska and then came
mhm.
back. So there's so much more to explore though. There's so much to be found in Canada, and I would love to just hear about just. I guess we should start with your story, sort of set the scene here. But we're going to talk about Canada for sure because I know there's been Canada just continues to pop up in the news the last few years, and as an American slash non-Canadian, I'm very curious of your thoughts on all the things that have been happening. But I guess just to sort of get things rolling and set the scene, could you give us a bit of backstory, just where you came from? Were you born and raised Canadian? Have you spent your whole life there? And sort of how did you end up in Bitcoin?
Yeah, okay. Whole life story. You know, it's funny. Every time you go on a new podcast, you kind of have to explain the news story. And so I'm trying to always think of what's like a different way I can explain it. And I think eventually I'm just going to come up with a song and then I'll just do the song each time. Like, this is the story all about how I found Bitcoin and whatever.
I think
But
I've done like 2 guest appearances at this point, and I can tell that I'm going to start making a template just so I can use that for all of them, because it's a lot
yeah,
of pressure to just go into it and be like, oh my gosh, my whole life story. Where do I even begin?
well,
But
I try to make it
it's
more concise each time because I don't want to bore people with, all that. But okay, I'll make it quick. I grew up on the west coast of Canada. So my parents moved here when I was, around 2 years old. I grew up on tiny little islands around the Gulf Islands. We rented places. Grew up pretty poor. My dad was in a lot of debt for most of my childhood, and yeah, was always really curious about how money worked because my dad was particularly affected in 2008 from the financial crisis. He was stuck in this high rate mortgage and he was on a fixed income. And I got really interested right around the time the Occupy Wall Street protests started happening. I was only a teenager at the time, but was really interested to see how all these banks got bailed out and the common person got nothing, and yet at the same time both political parties supported that unilateral action. And so I thought that was a little bit weird, but I didn't get involved in Bitcoin back then, unfortunately. Should have. I was primed. The mindset was there. I was primed, but didn't really find Bitcoin until 2013, when I wanted to buy some fun stuff off the internet with it. Bought it out of utility. I just needed to buy stuff on the internet with it, and it was the only way to like send digital cash to places that didn't take credit cards. Also, I don't think I was old enough to have a credit card, so there's another story there. Used it one off. Bought the most expensive ounce of weed I've ever bought in my life, and then found out about it again in 2016 when I graduated university because I had a little bit of leftover student loans and I wanted to kind of invest it into something at the time. So I was looking around. Bitcoin came back on the radar. So did Ethereum at the time. So did marijuana stocks in Canada. Put a little bit of the money in all of those things. My first real foray, I guess, first real purchase into Bitcoin, I also went into Ethereum, and it was 3 days before the DAO hack. And I was just starting to learn and understand what all those things were and what decentralization was and hard forks and soft forks. And all I knew was the price of Ethereum dropped 50% in 3 days. And I couldn't quite understand, like, what does that mean? Like, do I not, like, did I lose? Did I, like, is that Ethereum gone? I didn't understand any of it. But when you have skin in the game, that's when you start to answer questions or ask questions. And so that happened. I kind of learned the difference between Bitcoin and Ethereum early on. Hodled, did what the hodlers all do. That went up. I got in at a very good time, fortunately. And that basically allowed me to kind of stop this path or change the path that I was on, which was that I was very into filmmaking and I wanted to go into Hollywood. And so I wanted to work my way up as, either an editor or something in the film industry, more creative. Was doing all these odd jobs, worked at a company at the time for a while as kind of an editor, assistant editor. And then when the price of Bitcoin and Ethereum went up, I realized I had enough wealth to kind of stop doing that for a bit and then also potentially start my own business doing this. Started my own video production company in around 2017, 2018. Bitcoin and Ethereum are still, doing their thing there, going up and down. Got interested in the idea of talking about it a little bit more because everyone in my family and my immediate proximity was always asking me all these questions about it. And I had to keep explaining it over and over and over to them. And then in the, I guess, winter of 2018, Quadriga CX, which was the largest Bitcoin exchange in Canada, the founder mysteriously died. I don't know if you know the story of Gerald Cotton. They made a few documentaries on him, but he was this founder of the largest Bitcoin exchange in Canada, mysteriously dies in India. Everyone's funds are basically trapped in there. And I had a good portion of mine in there too. And I was shook. Like, it was a large part of my wealth just basically gone. And so my therapy for all that was, after a few days of recoiling and thinking I was such an idiot for not getting, a wallet set up, I decided to make a video about it. And I tried to investigate it and understand it and explain it from my perspective because I had had actually spoken to his support staff, and I guess through him directly at one point, to get some of my funds out of there right before the whole thing went down, because it was looking a little slippery before he mysteriously died. I was lucky enough to pull out some funds before then, and then I still lost a good chunk of them. But I made a whole video about that. It did pretty well, and I thought, okay, that's fun. I've never really been on camera before talking about these things, but I make films, so why not get in front of the camera too. Then I just went down this rabbit hole. 2018, 2019, no one really cared about Bitcoin. There was that little pop in 2017, people really cared. Made a couple little videos explaining, what is Ethereum, what is DeFi, what are some other companies you can buy in the stock market that will give you Bitcoin-like exposure. Did those kind of as a hobby. And then the pandemic hits in 2020. I see the price of Bitcoin crater, and then I see it rocket back up. And then on the day of my birthday, or around then, Michael Saylor does his first purchase of Bitcoin. And I was like, what? How is a company buying so much Bitcoin all out of the blue? That seems random, but also maybe I'm not crazy for doing this for the last 3 years. Now it seems to be getting some more legit support. I see him go on podcasts and he's explaining, Bitcoin is energy, and, Bitcoin is time, and cyber hornets and all this stuff. And it finally, I'd been in it long enough, but it finally clicked when Michael Saylor started talking about it for me. I was like, yeah, like I had watched Andreas Antonopoulos videos, but it finally clicked when Saylor started speaking about it. And I realized that's kind of the missing component in the world of Bitcoin, is that we just don't have sometimes the right messengers to really communicate the value effectively. Like all the pieces, all of it is still there, but we have a very tech and engineering savvy group of people that leads all these things. And those people are not necessarily the best storytellers. Michael Saylor is an engineering type, but he's also an incredible storyteller. The way that he uses, all his metaphors to kind of explain how Bitcoin works, how money really is energy, and how, fat is like a battery, like all these little things and connections he made. And I realized, I think this is what I have to do. I have to get better at storytelling like Saylor is, and then combine that with my knowledge of video production to do some sort of other videos on Bitcoin. And so since 2020, I've just been on this whirlwind of doing documentaries, shorts about Bitcoin, interviewing other people, just trying and experimenting with all these different creative mediums to try and, number one, educate people about Bitcoin concepts, but also make people more naturally curious about it who wouldn't be. There's a big barrier to entry of Bitcoin, which is that if you don't have disposable income, why the hell would you bother studying this thing? If it's an investment to everyone, right? This is an investment. Why would I bother learning about this? But people will spend endless amounts of time learning how to make a video game, or learning how to make, movies, or learning, acting, who will never act, who will never make movies of their own, who will never be a game designer. And so if people are naturally curious in those things without having skin in the game, why wouldn't the same be there with Bitcoin? It just needs to be explained better to people to take an interest in it. And then eventually, if you're really convicted, then you go out and buy some, and then you go on my path. But long-winded explanation, my curiosity into Bitcoin basically drove me into wanting to use the talents that I had, which was in video production, to do storytelling in it. And that's kind of been the journey thus far. We can get into the whole current year thing later if you want, but yeah, now we're a team of 3 and growing of creators under Get-based, doing stuff on Bitcoin, but also sovereignty. And yeah, that's my life story. Damn it.
I just realized I think I
already
totally
went
screwed
10
up
plus
your...
minutes on that one.
Oh,
But
I love
whatever.
it. I love it. It's great. I just realized I think I screwed up your intro. I introduced you as Kinetic Finance, but is that officially retired? Or are you
You
now
can
full
use
on
Kinetic
Get-based?
Finance still. I still use it. My
Okay.
my business that does video production is called Kinetic Cuts. So I just kind of threw that moniker into
You're
finance.
keeping it in the bag.
I'm keeping it in
name.
there. I'm
Yeah.
keeping it in there.
Well, man, our timelines are so similar. We have to be almost the same age. Are you around 30 as well?
Yeah, turning 30 next year.
Yeah, I'm turning 30 this month, so we're like pretty much similar. We're at a similar age for each of those steps, and it's like I've heard a lot of echoes from my own story in that. So that's cool. And there are so many people.
Did you
like
also spend an exorbitant amount of Bitcoin on drugs, or is that just me?
No, I didn't. I did not. For me, but the thing that I have exactly similar is when it comes to crypto and learning that lesson, and also the putting Bitcoin in these yield things. I've seen quite a few of those things happen as well. I Everybody loses something from crypto, I feel like. And for me, I didn't lose that much money like you did. I just spent years of time doing it, and I just am angry that I was scammed for that long and like actually believed the scammers. And I had like the crypto blog, and I was talking about these different altcoins, which one's going to do this utility and that utility. And I look back now, I was just like, oh, if I would have just been involved in Bitcoin that whole time, I would have had so much more. Well, I definitely would have stacked more Bitcoin. I also would have just had more good content out there about Bitcoin instead of all this now crypto trash that just I know is just all meaningless.
Mm-hmm.
So everyone has a similar path, I feel like, and still to this day. I mean, this was like 2017 to 2020 when I was going through that lesson, and now we're in 2024, almost 2025, and people are still getting yoinked into the crypto realm. Still, that's
Mm-hmm.
crazy to me. Do you think that's ever going to change, or what's going to cause that long learning stretch to finally be eliminated? Is it ever going to be eliminated?
I think it gets eliminated as soon as people recognize the analog of history that these things kind of represent. I saw a really great post the other day, and I don't know, when this is going live, but I think people have noticed obviously over the last 2 years, like the Ethereum to Bitcoin ratio has been slashed in half and then some. And people are, wondering, oh, is Ethereum just underpriced? Oh, we got an ETF, blah, blah, blah. Like they can't figure out why is the value of Ethereum, like every time Bitcoin goes down, Ethereum goes down more. And when Bitcoin goes up, Ethereum doesn't go up as much. And it's sort of, somebody pointed out this really great analog, which is that Ethereum is sort of like the Intel of this cycle in terms of compute. Intel was the undisputed leader of compute and processing and all this stuff, but they never adapted, right? They never adapted, and now Nvidia, which was worth I think a half of what Intel was worth just 3 years ago, is now worth I think upwards of 10 times what Intel is worth. And Intel now, if you look at history, Intel, it's not insignificant. It still has a role. People are using Intel processors, but you're talking about a company that has had the exact same market cap for the last 20 years, basically. It has had no fiat appreciation for the last 20 years. I think the same thing is going on with Ethereum, where I don't think that these things die. People will keep looking for ways to decentralize something. There's obviously a use case there for stable coins and having a ledger for that. Bitcoin does not have a great ledger for, moving around stablecoin value. You have to do it on a layer 2, and it's nice that you can do it on a layer 1 with Ethereum. But beyond that, like the market has had time to figure out use cases for these other blockchains, and they've kind of landed on the fact that, well, NFTs, no one really cares. No one's really using them as memberships to do X, Y, or Z. And collectibles are just this tiny niche market. They're too expensive for the average person, anyways, to transact with. So that's going to be its tiny little thing that'll, again, I don't think these things are going to go to zero, but you're just going to have this tiny, maybe it's $100 million market and it just stays that way for the next, 20 years. Maybe stable coins are, a couple $1 billion market. But I think a lot of Bitcoiners take this view that like they're all going to zero. It's like they're not going to zero, but a worse fate is almost that they just go sideways in perpetuity, because the people that believe in them will just keep saying, oh, it's undervalued. Oh, it's undervalued. Like you look at Ripple, for example. It's been around, it's less than it was worth 8 years ago. And yet there's still some people that are thinking, oh, Ripple's value, it's just about to moon.
Buy the
I don't think
dip, the
Ripple's ever going to
7 year dip.
zero. I don't think Ripple's ever going to zero, but it can stay at, if it can stay at 50 cents for 8 years, it can stay at 50 cents for another 8 years. And I think the exact same thing is going to happen with a lot of these other coins. 99% of them will go to zero, but that 1%, that other 1%, could also just go sideways forever. And then you can just be delusional and just keep watching the value compared to Bitcoin go down. So I say this to the people in the altcoin space, like you don't want to look at the fiat price, because the fiat price can keep you delusional that your thing is just, treading water. You want to look at the Bitcoin price. And if your coin has not appreciated in Bitcoin terms for the last, 4 or 5 years, then I'm sorry, like you picked the wrong coin. And I don't think there is a single coin that has appreciated in Bitcoin terms that's been around for 5 years. There's only those little momentary blips in certain bull markets where they outperform Bitcoin. But on the long-term charts, there's not a single altcoin that has outperformed Bitcoin's, historic 5-year performance. You can take any 5-year period. call it Cardano, Solana, Ethereum, they've just all underperformed over the 5-year axis. And that's really the one that you're supposed to look for. So don't buy altcoins. You're just going to waste your time and you're going to have less Bitcoin at the end of it.
Absolutely. One of the few fancy words I remember from my fiat education math class was asymptote. At the asymptote gets closer and closer and closer to that axis, that x-axis, which is zero. It may never get there, but it's always going to keep getting closer to zero.
Yeah.
So that's how I sort of view altcoins. They're, like versus Bitcoin, they're just going to keep going down, and there's always going to be one or two idiots that are going to stay in until the last breath. But
Mm-hmm.
you don't want to be on that ship. You want to pick the right ship that's winning.
Yeah.
And it's going to be a much more prosperous story for you, and as I think you and I would agree, future generations of your family. Like this is like big stuff, like
Mm-hmm.
you are that ancient human that was walking on the beach and just saw some gold on the ground and picked it up because it looked cool before gold became the currency, and you just all of a sudden you were way ahead of the curve. And you can
Yeah.
practically, I would say you can practically pick up Bitcoin just like you pick up gold, but just by throwing these pieces of paper that we have now called dollars. And a lot of people don't understand you won't be able to trade monopoly money for Bitcoin forever.
Mm-hmm.
Eventually the market will realize that Bitcoin is real money, fiat is just trash, and
Mm-hmm.
so trade it while you can, because exchanges are a temporary phenomenon. Do you
Yeah.
think about it the same way?
Yeah. Bitcoin really teaches you, the longer that you're in it, it makes you interested in history because number one, you can't really have a low time preference unless you have a sense of understanding of history and other times where that's paid off. Because if you're constantly living in the moment and your time horizon is only like a year, you only see a year behind you and a year ahead of you, then you're not going to get Bitcoin. That has to change in order for you to finally get to the point where you're like, yeah, I think I'll hodl this for my grandchildren, right? Um, but yeah, that's the big problem with fiat world is essentially all decisions are made off of short-term performance and short-term marketing. Like there's all these guttural instincts to just do things faster and faster and faster, and we're seeing that with the Federal Reserve. We used to say, oh, the Federal Reserve is a lagging indicator, right? They're always slow. Yeah, they are, but now you're seeing them cut rates before there's been any signs that, in the data, at least the official data that we're given, that they should be cutting rates. Now they're trying to get ahead of the curve. And fiat is almost this. I mean, our friend Peruvian talks about this like fiat black hole. And as you get closer to the center, time compresses, right? Until it's gone.
And speaking of history, the Fed and our friend Peruvian Bull, you gentlemen, along with Ian Carroll, Isabella, went on an adventure down to Jekyll Island recently. That
Oh,
looked
yeah.
freaking awesome. I'm super jealous. I saw those pictures of you guys just like walking around, seeing all this. It's super freaking cool. Walk me through that adventure, dude. How did that come about? And give me the highlights.
Um, I read this. I read the book from I think it's G. Edward Griffith or Griffin.
Griffin, I think, yeah.
Great
Mm-hmm.
book. A little long. A little long. It's a tome.
It's a thick
But
boy. I've
it's a
seen it.
really. Sorry, I missed it. I missed what you said.
It's a thick boy. It's like
Yeah,
good couple inches. I haven't read it myself, but I need to. The Creature from Jekyll Island, for people listening. It's classic.
it's like an 18-hour ebook or an 18-hour audiobook. So that tells you how much time. Maybe you can read it a little faster than you can speak it, but it's a long book. Um, but I was always fascinated by the story. It seems very, cinematic. These 8 bankers or banking associates gather, in the dark of night to go down to this island to craft up this new central banking system. And immediately when you think about that, you think about, okay, why do they have to sneak to do it? Why didn't the government want something like this in the public? And there's all these questions that form around it. And then the documentary we made ultimately will address a lot of those. But the main reason I wanted to go down there was I looked up photos. It's one of the oldest places in America. A lot of really interesting, strange things have happened on that island, unrelated to the Federal Reserve. At one point, 25% of the entire world's wealth had property on that island. So it's like Billionaires Row, but it was on an island. And so it just made me curious, like, why? What's so cool about this place that all the Rockefellers and Vanderbilts and all that would have cottages there? And I looked at photos, and it's kind of got these like, these big draping willows, and it's got these beautiful sandy long beaches on one side and kind of this bayou river on the other. And I thought, well, two things. Number one, I don't think anybody's really ever captured, that island very well, because I've seen some photos of it, and we know the name, but no one's really kind of seen it visually. And the second part was that whole story, as interesting as it is in that book, has not been adapted to this generation. Like, how do you get people interested in, the history of central banking in a kind of unique way? And I think the way that I figured out how to do it was we go there, we explore the island like an expedition, but we also tell the story of Jekyll Island, and we go through three parts. We go, what was, the world before central banking and before Jekyll Island? What actually went down to initiate this meeting? What initially, what was the meeting all about? What it really is the Federal Reserve, if you can explain it in a couple sentences, which is impossible. What immediately happened after, and then tying that all back to how does this weird happenstance thing on an island actually affect you and me? Because I think that's the part that people don't get. It's like, okay, it's this cool, interesting moment from history, but what's in it for me? What are the stakes for me? How does that affect, what is a financial crisis? Are financial crises engineered by the Fed? Like, we don't think about all these things and all these questions, but if you look at it, there's just so much evidence that shows that every single recession that we've had has been the result of centralized planning, typically from the Fed, not the government, creating these things. And there's another realization too in there, without spoiling the whole doc, that I think a lot of us get caught up in the government is the root of all evil and the government makes all these decisions. But if you look at the real power structure, the government is beholden to the Federal Reserves. And if you look at the Rothschilds back in Europe in the 16s and the 1700s and the 1800s, and you look at Napoleon and the Napoleonic Wars, you realize that the story of so much of history that we thought are just governments fighting each other for power grabs are governments fighting central bankers to be free and to be able to participate and do things on behalf of their citizens. That unlock, we're really working on the documentary right now. We're in the thick of it, but we're hoping to like unlock that in the doc for people to think about, that the power to create and issue money is so much bigger than the power to just create laws and the power to create constitutions. It's like the ultimate cheat code. And none of us question or talk about it enough. And there needs to be a serious awakening to that, and a serious, incorporation of that into our vocabulary, because we're just so focused on these little pinhole issues, and we don't realize like the main perpetrator of all the chaos and the wealth inequality comes from this entity that just masks itself in obfuscation from every angle.
I love that. That's like a perfectly like twist of a spicy take. It's not really the government's fault, it's the central bankers. And we hear bankers sort of brought into these phrases all the time, like all wars are banker wars is one that comes to mind. Like we talk about how it really all just comes down to the bankers, but it seems like the government is kind of like such a big entity. It's just so vague and large. It's sort of the easiest to throw rocks at. And I definitely do that myself. I just sort of, default to that. But I'm really excited to see this movie, because I feel like that will help clarify a little bit where the real root cause, because that's what we all need to figure out, is what is the root cause of the fiat disease. And I often say it's the money printer. Well, if it's the money printer, then the money printer is the banks. Mm-hmm. So that would right there prove your case correct.
Yeah. Well, everybody needs a foil. And I think that's why it's been so easy for the Federal Reserve to go unscathed or uncriticized. Because if you just think about it from an optics perspective, like Trump, like whether you like him or hate him, he is the perfect villain. Like, he's this big, boisterous guy. He's a bully. I don't think that's really deniable. He's this slick-haired billionaire, and he says these oafish words. And then you have perfect villains on the other side too. You have Hillary Clinton, who has these like crazy bulging eyes, and Kamala. And it's like we have these characters as if they're in a set piece, and they're perfect characters to direct our frustration at if you just look at it from a story perspective. All we are is an audience to the stuff that they're putting on. It's all just theatrics. But when you look at the people who run the Federal Reserve, they're all these, like, Jack Mallers has this perfect term to describe Janet Yellen, who's one of the Fed chairs. He calls her a garden gnome. Like, look up a photo of Janet Yellen. She looks like a little garden gnome. And you look at Jerome Powell and Alan Greenspan, these are very monotone people who talk very sullen and just like straight way, and they're very calculated in the way that they speak, and the market goes up and down based on, they cannot show any emotion. They have to be the most robotic people. And if you think about the challenge, like how do we make people upset at central banking when you don't really have a great villain for it? Like who are these people? They're just the most monotonous, like kept, like if they were maniacal like Trump, yeah, it would be easy to make them figureheads of a movement and a revolution against them, but it's hard. It's really hard to take the central bank, visualize what it is, have a spokesperson. They never say something crazy out of character that would, warrant you throwing a giant movement or protest against them. But that's exactly what they want. It's all in the messaging, and they've nailed it. They've nailed it. They just slip perfectly under the radar.
Yeah, that's such a great point, and I love hearing your perspective on that as a filmmaking guy. You can tell the characters and the actors. You can see that, like you can cut
Mm-hmm.
right through it. And, I mean, there's so many examples. Just earlier today, I was watching this montage of Kamala Harris speaking at different events, and she changes her complete accent everywhere she goes. Like
Mm-hmm.
she just sounds like a different person everywhere she goes, and I'm like, she's acting. This is like she's completely changing who she is just to like appease voters. It's so fake sounding, and it's just like,
Mm-hmm.
ugh. It just there's so many aspects of that. It's crazy, and I'm curious. Do you think that Occupy Wall Street is the closest we've gotten to being correct and finding the real villain, and we eventually fizzled out? Because, like you mentioned, you and
Mm-hmm.
I were both very young when that was going on. I hardly really remember. I wasn't paying attention. But looking back now, I've heard quite a few people say that we were so close to figuring it out, but they successfully sort of rug pulled that operation by sneaking in certain strategies to basically, just get people back at being angry at each other. They
Mm-hmm.
love the peasants to be mad at each other, left versus right, green or blue versus red. That's where
Mm-hmm.
they like people to be. But do you think that was close to being correct? The closest we've been?
Well, I'll give you an interesting part of the doc that we kind of explore. But America had tooled with the idea of a central bank between the founding of the Constitution in the 1770s and 1910, when I believe the Federal Reserve Act was enacted. There were three attempts to bring in a central bank. They had the Central Bank of North America, and Thomas Jefferson was the loudest spokesperson against the founding of a central bank back then. But one of the main reasons that the Federal Reserve meeting, the Jekyll Island meeting, had to be secret is because the public was actually really well informed about the dangers of a central bank. They understood it. They had this idea that, oh, if we have a central bank that creates money, they're just going to siphon off all the wealth. That was the generic public perspective of an average, everyday, not even college educated New Yorker. That was running in the newspaper. The journalists were printing this stuff. That's why they had to go down there in secret. The average journalist nowadays could not tell you a word about the Federal Reserve. The average journalist nowadays probably doesn't even know who Jerome Powell is. They could be a political commentator and not even know who that is and what that role of Fed chairman does. We have become so removed because we have all these other political issues on the spectrum from even having the vocabulary of knowing what the central bank is and knowing where money comes from in our what's the word in our dictionary of just things that we understand and know of in our I can't think of words. I'm
In the
off of my words.
intellectual zeitgeist
Our zeitgeist,
vocabulary.
yeah, it's just
Yeah.
not in the zeitgeist. It's zero placement does the Federal Reserve have in our zeitgeist. Like we randomly walked up to people during the dock and asked them, like, do you know about the Federal Reserve and what happened here? And people are just vacationing in Jekyll Island. They're like, nope, no idea. You know, it's just not there. And so Occupy Wall Street, it got close, but I felt that the anger at Occupy Wall Street was not directed at central banking, and it was more directed at the banking executives who got away with murder. Now, you can argue that those banking executives do essentially run the central bank because they have shares in it and all that. And you could also make the argument that, yeah, does Jerome Powell and the Fed chairman, are they really at the top of this, or is it Jamie Dimon and the people who really control the main, 5, 6 banks in the United States? Or is it another player in Israel that we don't know of and I won't go too deep into? It's hard to know. And I think, again, that's intentionally the point, is if you don't know the power apparatus within the Federal Reserve, you can't direct your anger towards it as an entity either, right? Like you have to know who controls this thing that you're angry at. Because this whole idea that we're just going to be able to channel our frustrations and our movement towards a faceless entity, it's really hard. You have to stick a face to it. And that's what Occupy was ultimately unsuccessful at doing. And it's a challenge that, we as Bitcoiners, I think we have to face as well. Is like, if we're going to convert people, we have to make them understand the perils of fiat. And if, we're to get angry about that, we have to direct it at something. I think we can get angry at a system that screws us over, but I think that anger can only catalyze into a movement when we start putting faces to it.
Because that is like where you really get the human connection. It's just like so rooted
You
in
have
the
to
human
make the human
psyche.
connection. Yeah.
You need to give them something to go after for the majority of the time. It's really hard to fight against just this vague entity, like I mentioned.
Well, I'll give you the flip side of this is they have the ammo to do it to us, right? They can connect a whole bunch of faces to Bitcoin. Michael Saylor is one of the new giant faces of Bitcoin. Whatever that guy says is pretty reflective of what a lot of Bitcoiners say, right? And you can tie all these people, the shadowy drug dealers, Sam Bankman-Fried, like they're able to do it pretty easily because all these people are they have larger than life personalities, and us Bitcoiners are pretty outspoken. You're never going to see a Federal Reserve board member go on a podcast or do an appearance outside of CNBC
except
News or
for
whatever.
Neil. I think that moment with Neil Kashkari was probably the most like prolific like banker moment that we've ever had on TV.
Very
Where he just
iconic.
comes
Look at
out and
his,
says,
his crazy eyes. Is
"Yeah,
like,
the big
we
guy
can
is like,
print as
oh,
much as we need to.
we can print forever. We just
Yeah.
print money."
Can you characterize everything that the Fed has done this past week as essentially flooding the system with money?
Yes, exactly.
And there's no end to your ability to do that.
There is no end to our ability to do that. There is an infinite amount of cash at the Federal Reserve.
Yeah, but look at the other people on the team, right? Alan Greenspan, he says like the United States will never default on debt because we have the ability to print money. And he's like this sleepy, old dude. I think he's pushing 90 now. It's like, nah, we're never going to be able to make that person the figurehead and where we need to channel our anger. But you need something. You need someone on it. And I don't know how that's going to happen,
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, that's part of the problem solving process for us, like creative people out there. They're trying to like make content to help people figure this stuff out. Is how do we resonate with those people? Mm-hmm. Because, like you mentioned there, this is an important point to highlight. The fact that the average person and just the general public back, and this was 1913 roughly when the Federal Reserve was officially founded, right? 1913. The people knew that this was a bad idea. They were informed because the journalists were doing their job and actually journaling and actually, digging into the real issues and speaking truth to power and fighting back against the corruption in the system, where we have the complete opposite today, which is now over 100 years later, which is kind of crazy to think about. Complete opposite. The journalists are a mouthpiece of the government. They are pushing out all of the narratives that the government wants to be seen, and perhaps the bankers as well, like you said. And so now, there's this new need for truly independent journalists and content creators and podcasters and YouTubers and TikTokers. Every platform works. Nostr is even better protocol. We can maybe talk about that later. Anyone can start this, and we're going to have to start from the grassroots level to fix this, I would say, because all of those large media entities are now captured. Is that sort of what you've seen as well?
Yeah, 100%. It's really hard. There's little glimmers of it in specials, but it's very hard to find good journalism in the mainstream media nowadays, and it's frustrating. And I think it's pretty clear now. The voices who were really good, who spoke truth to power, they all got booted off the networks, right? Megyn Kelly, Tucker Carlson, and now they're just running their own independent media empires. The free market decided that these people have something important to say, and now they're able to fund and do their own media empires, which is great, But think about this. Take a whole bunch of these journalists. Take George Stephanopoulos. I'm just naming some American ones, but there's a lot of journalists right now that have big mouthpieces because they're on these, big networks. Anderson Cooper. Throw those guys out. Tell them you got to do your own independent network and grow it. See how they do, because a couple of them have. Like Don Lemon's a really good example of one where that guy was always talking BS, didn't really provide value to anyone. He gets thrown out. He tries to do his own media empire, and it is struggling because free market's very good at finding. the free market's very good at finding the truth. And it turns out that nobody wants what Don Lemon's selling. Like, the guy is just not a good journalist, not persuasive. His bias is just not, he can't find an audience for it, because the people who typically watch that stuff, they like watching stuff from, big authoritative publications. So there's no audience for it. And that's great. Like, the free market's not perfect, but it's very good at sussing out propped up talent versus real talent.
That's such a good point. The fact that the audience that's looking for that sort of content is already sort of just looking for the authority figures which are fed to them by the TV. So they're not really looking for a new, different sort of information source. So they're not going to go follow these people elsewhere. They're just going to stick with the behemoth.
Yeah.
That's the source.
Go and fire all those, interview TV hosts you can't stand. Tell them to go start a media empire on their own. Even give them some funding to do it. Within a year or two, most of them are gone. The market will weed out the ones that people actually want to listen to. You can't pay your way to attention. That's like the number one thing I've learned is you actually have to create value for people, or else you just don't get the views. And there's times where, you can be just great at something and be undervalued. But the thing is you have to just keep taking shots at the net, right? You can't be like, oh, I created something that was amazing and nobody watched it, therefore the market's decided, I'm garbage. You make a genuine effort, you do this stuff every day for a year or two, like you'll get your signal if you're good, right?
How has that process been for you, learning how to find the type of content that really resonates with the most people? Because you make a different sort of content than most Bitcoiners. You make short form video, like 1 minute videos with imagery and storytelling, and you're very energetic about it. You're very much going for that piece which I believe is so needed, which is the more like smaller bite-sized pieces. Like I'm doing like 1 to 2 hour podcast episodes. I'm well aware that most millennials, Gen Z people aren't going to go directly to that. They're going to spend more time scrolling the feeds and just getting the quick info. So I really think that is such an important piece. So what has your journey been figuring out what works in that world and what gets the most people woken up on Bitcoin?
I mean, I don't think I'm fully there yet. I think there's a lot of work to be done. But if I was to boil it down, I would say I watch a lot of shows like yours and long forms and, What Bitcoin Did, Robert Breedlove, like all these great podcasts. I read Proving Bulls articles. I think the thing is that you guys are targeting like a very financially literate audience and a very high IQ audience. And that doesn't mean that the concepts themselves cannot be understood by people who are, lower IQ or just don't have the propensity to, learn Bitcoin. But you need to have a translator. And that's sort of where I feel my skills lie, is I'm able to take these large things, and I've worked really hard at figuring out how do I boil this down to 170 words. And it's not only about reducing the word count and simplifying a concept. It's also about how do you tie it to like a real world thing that sort of everyone understands. And I'm always on the lookout for how to improve that vocabulary. And I think that's one of the things that Bitcoiners struggle with, because Bitcoiners are, I don't want to, bloat our egos, but I think if you took a sample sizing of most of us, let's just say that are active and consume podcasts, I'd say that our IQs are pretty high. I don't think we'd be watching, these very in-depth macro analysis things just to entertain us or placate us. I think we understand a lot of what these people are saying and what's going on in them. And so I would say the average Bitcoiner that's been in it for 3 years probably has an IQ much higher than the rest of the population. That's not a problem, but I think sometimes with that, there becomes a sense of complacency that I can just talk to my little in-group of people. And so my thing has always been, look, like, I think we have to branch out. I don't think you need to be a genius. They have like the mid-curve meme or whatever. And my stuff it kind of rests, in between all those things. And I find that the number one way to break into a conversation generally is through either comedy or controversy. And so usually when I start my pieces of content out, I either try and make you laugh or I try and shock you a little bit. And then you're going to hear the rest of what I have to say. But it's still very important that how I structure that is still, able to be followed by people who don't have a ton of vocabulary and the type of things that we do, right? It's great working with Isabella because she also came from the world of entertainment and fashion, right? And she kind of got pulled into Bitcoin out of curiosity, but she also had that problem of, man, you start to interview and talk to some of these people and it feels like you're talking to an alien. And if we can all agree that money universally affects us, like we got to get out of that. We got to start, I don't want to say dumb our content down, but really think about the average person who needs this like content more. And that's where a lot of it comes from for me is I want to make these videos for people who, number one, need it and don't know that they need it. But I also want to make this content for people who disagree with me. And I've probably strayed down that a little bit too much recently, in the sense that I'm making a lot of videos that purposely shock or frustrate people on the left, but with the hope that eventually I make a persuasive enough argument for them to go down the rabbit hole and kind of question, centralized power structures and whether or not they're a good thing. Like I'll start out and I'll say, communism will never work, or all you commies are living in la la land. And then I'll try and break it down in a way that sort of makes sense. And you might disagree with me in the end. You might be like, this guy's just like a bootlicker, anarcho-capitalist, like corporate scum or whatever. But every now and then, even if it's just like 1 in 100 of people who are like super entrenched on the left, they watch that video and they think, hey, maybe, I don't have all the answers. Then I've done my job, right? And so, yeah, there's a lot of experimentation, but yeah, it's super fun to try and pull in new people who would never watch this sort of content into watching it.
I resonate super hard with that because I grew up in Seattle. You grew up just a bit up north. Most of our friends growing up, I can assume your side, were very much on the left. My family
I
was
was
on the
left,
left.
man.
Yeah,
I
was
wanted
too.
everything.
Yeah.
I wanted government funded everything, man. I wanted governments to start buying houses for us. We deserve housing as a human right. Like I was into all that stuff for sure.
Same here. Yeah. And it's a product of the environment, and that environment is growing and growing because, just frankly, it's emotionally driven. Because things that feel good but don't require a lot of thinking are sort of what get you when you're in that headspace. And that's sort of been a whole rabbit hole for me of just figuring out, like, how was I fooled by this, and how are so many people who mean so well and really care, or they're very, like, the classic example is like the vegans, right? They care so much about the animals, people, the environment, whatever, but they're really doing the exact opposite of what they should be doing for that. And that's been a whole health rabbit hole for me of carnivore kills the least animals. It's the best for the environment. It's best for your health. It makes you the most spiritually connected. And so they've really just been sold this huge lie. And there's a ton of ossification around it now where it's really hard to break through those people because it's built on emotions. They were fed Netflix documentaries that gave them these pictures that make them feel a certain way. And they didn't, dig into the actual information of the films that were just pure lies and completely owned by these chemical companies that are trying to shoehorn in this idea that eating chemicals is good for humans, and it's all part of that fiat machine that's this profiting off of people being sick and confused and not, full of testosterone and energy to fight back. They just kind of lay back and let it happen, like you and I both did when we were, younger, growing up in these systems, sort of like, oh yeah, like government and healthcare, of course, like, oh, free school, give me more free things, like free stuff. That's just sort of when you're at a really low level of consciousness, all this free stuff everywhere sounds great. And it sounds like if you're saying that there shouldn't be free stuff, you're mean, you're against, you're so anti people. And this is when I talk to family members about, welfare and, just these sorts of topics where the poorest in society are given handouts, and I try to bring up, like, why do they even need handouts in the first place? Like, it's because inflation is happening, and we shouldn't have to have these handouts, and it's just so ossified in now that we need to have these handouts for people that are poor. We have to print more money to stop inflation, which is just the most insane one of all. We heard that one, like the Inflation Reduction Act, where they print a bunch of money to stop inflation.
Well, here's the problem is that, like, I think we all have the right ideas, right? We need to stop eating garbage. We need to stop printing money. But the problem is a lot of those ideas can be dogmatic because, okay, sure, yeah, that's the root problem, but you don't really have a solution. This is the problem with libertarians in general. It's like, it's a lot of whining and not a lot of solutions that are actually doable and implementable, because yeah, it would be so easy to abolish. Yeah, sure, very easy to abolish the Fed. Sure, you can do a lot of work. You can propose a bill. It's never going to get passed. You have so much persuasion that you're going to have to do any of these massive changes that you want to do. right? There is such an education curve and a persuasion curve that you need to overcome in order to actually make any of these changes. What Bitcoin does, and what people don't understand about it that much, is that it allows you to actually act on first principles, because all it takes, every little bit of monetary energy that you siphon into that currency, instead of putting it into a speculation like a stock or a house or just cash in a bank, you're starving the existing system, right? I mean, a lot of people, they don't vote because they think, oh, my vote doesn't really matter. It's only one of me, and there's, 300 million of the other people. But there's a nice thing which is called one person, one vote. And so, yeah, you might not like to participate in politics, but you actually do have a bit of a voice, especially now as things are very tight. And if you don't want to vote, for party A or party B, still do your part and, write in Satoshi on the ballot. Like, you have that power. You get one of those a year. Why would you just stay home and be a loser about it? I'm really anti, not going out and participating about that whole thing. Just write Satoshi. It's fine. But you also vote with your money, right? And we might feel that, oh, I'm just a pleb, I'm barely scraping by. Maybe I'm in debt. Like, how could I possibly, have any votes with my money? But you do, right? And there's so many of us in the Bitcoin space that are struggling, that are in debt, but we're siphoning whatever energy that we have into a system that makes it impossible for them to dilute the food, to start endless wars, to manipulate people with lobbying. There's so many things that you cannot do in the existing system that we don't like in the Bitcoin system. And so your vote is put money into the Bitcoin system, hold Bitcoin. People don't realize how powerful of a vote that is. And it seems small, but the world is moving towards putting as much capital as possible into that system. And if you do it now, you get a vote that weighs more than your vote in the future, because the price of Bitcoin will likely go up. And that's, I need to make that into a short right there. But basically, money is your second vote, right? And if you don't allocate it properly or you waste it, you're wasting your vote. It's as simple as that.
And not to mention all the differences you experience yourself as an individual, mentally, physically, and spiritually, by all of a sudden having possession of something that can't be stolen from you. Mm-hmm. Because even though most people don't really understand the mechanics of inflation, how the money they're holding is literally programmed to debase. It's not even money, it's currency. That's a shout out to Mike Maloney. He taught me that one. I'm trying to remember to differentiate those two. Currency can be printed, money can't. Everyone's holding these dollar currencies, and they know that it's buying less every year. They, like, subconsciously, they're not really tracking it most of the time, because they're just living hand to mouth. They're fighting for it. They're trying to tread water right now, but that feeling of helplessness is so deep inside them that they know that something's wrong. And then once you have a form of money that can't be debased, where over year, every single year, it just continues to gain value. And, of course, some people get shaken out by the volatility, the spikes up and down. Like, some people you can't help if they're really shaken out by that. But the majority that get into this, the Bitcoiners we know, when we talk about Bitcoiners, they really gain this very long-term view and this really self-loving view that they didn't have before, because they're finally able to plan. It's that simple. Like, you can actually plan for the future, and you have this sovereignty aspect that you didn't have before. Because when you're holding all of your wealth in dollars or pesos or yen or any of the government monopoly tickets, you're at their behest. They're not, you don't own your own labor, and that's a huge mental burden for people, that even when, like I said, even if they don't fully understand it, they can feel it. And it just changes the way that you live your life. So, like you said, it's really important to vote with your money. And as we would say, voting by buying Bitcoin. I think that buying Bitcoin is the most powerful vote you can make. And I know you sort of just made that case, but could you maybe give your case for why buying Bitcoin is actually changing the world? Because I know so many people hear us say that on the socials, and they think that sounds too hyperbolic, how buying Bitcoin is going to save the world. What would be, if you were to make a short right now on the fly,
Oh,
how
dude,
buying
that's
Bitcoin
hard.
helps the world.
I'm very not off the cuff, but give me a couple seconds and I'll think about it.
I love it. Let's do it.
So yeah, like how is you buying Bitcoin change the world? Um, Everything that you buy, whether it's real estate, whether it's money, anything that you buy to store the value of your time, you're pooled into a network of other people who are trying to use the same thing to do that with. So when you keep your money in dollars, you're sharing a pool of people that hope that the dollars will also maintain their value. When you invest your money in real estate, you're joining a network of other real estate investors that also hope that their number go up. When you're investing in gold, you're joining a network of other people who have, invested their time in gold, and also people that use gold to store value. And so, whether you participate in that group as an active contributor, you're talking about gold, you're talking about real estate and chatting up with your chums is one thing, but you're hoping that the collective efforts of the real estate owners, the gold owners, the world around you channels more and more time into that. What's really important is that you channel all your time into the one that is going to do the best, not only for yourself, but for the world. And I think when you look at the morality of all these things, Bitcoin just comes out on top. Bitcoin is a currency that it's a store of value that is funded on principles without rulers, that is uncorruptible on basically every level, that allows participation from everyone, every walk of life. There's no, jurisdictional barrier to it. It has very little barrier of entry based on what your wealth is as well. And you have full ownership rights to it as well. So you're doing the world a favor when you inject your energy and time into a system that is fairer than basically every other system of storing your wealth that exists on planet Earth. And you might just be a small, frog in a big pond when it comes to Bitcoin. But if you channel your energy into that system, other people will follow. And that's how you change the world, by buying Bitcoin.
Beautiful. Love it. Fantastic.
Was that under a minute? I don't know.
That's great. And I think that ending part is really powerful too. The fact that people, if you just take that stand and begin making those moves, people will follow. And
Yeah.
I think that this is something that I'm also trying to push people toward on the show is becoming creators, less lurkers, more creators. And there's nothing against the people who, just like to consume content. If they're out there, listening to podcasts, learning, that's amazing. That's great. But I know that there are a lot of them out there who have the capacity to create something awesome. And there's so many different ways you can do that. A funny example just popped in my head. Have you heard of the Huck the Sock account?
Oh, dude, he was in my collab video. Yeah, he's amazing.
That's a perfect example. Like, what a creative way. This guy just makes a sock puppet and just like rants with the sock puppet about, really important topics. And it's so beautiful and amazing. And there's just infinite ways that people can get out there. And
Yeah.
you don't have to make it super crazy. You can just start a podcast like me, or just, start posting videos like Julian. There's infinite ways. So
Yeah.
what is your case for the people out there that are maybe on the fence about making that transition from more of a lurker consumer to a creator? Why should they make that jump?
Look, the hardest thing about being a creator, honestly, is that the amount that the market, first of all, the market just continually gets more competitive. And then the amount that the market is willing to pay for your content is very deflationary. Like, we pay less for our media now than ever because of the internet. So you cannot get into it because you want to make money, and you likely shouldn't spend a ton of time getting into it unless you are somewhere that is somewhat financially secure. Because sometimes, if you're lucky, I know some people who their first video goes viral, and then it's good to go, and then the business model can develop pretty early on. But it's taken me years, and I was in a very fortunate enough spot to have a lot of capital to put into these things. And I still get frustrated with the amount of money I put into it, that maybe I'm not where I think I should be, or maybe I've just spent time on the wrong things. But you have to be patient, and you have to really love it. Like, you can't pursue this journey of content creation because you think it will be an exit from whatever your current job is or whatever your current financial situation is. You have to be willing to do it for free, and the market will demand that you do it for free to begin with anyways. So just be comfortable doing it longer than you might think. Set that expectation early on, And then from there, just find out what makes your voice unique. It might just be the fact that you're just a better presenter at the same thing as everyone else, and you can just keep doing that. And eventually you'll rise to the top, just being an excellent presenter or perspective or point of view. Or you can find your unique attributes in the medium that you present in. I think for me, I don't know how interesting I am as a person to listen to, and that's why I didn't start my own podcast, or I've tried, but it just hasn't gone anywhere. So I realized like me just talking and whatever is not I'm no Peter McCormack, let's just say, right? So that's not my thing, and I found that out, but it took a while. But what I did find is that I was killer at doing these shorts because nobody else was doing them, and I was able to find what my thing was pretty quick. And whatever you find your thing is not your thing forever. It doesn't have to be. You can change, you can adapt, you can try new things, but you want to find what makes you unique. It's either in your personality, the way that you talk, the way that you use language, or it's in the way that you apply your creative skills. Find that out. Hopefully you enjoy doing that, and then just be freaking persistent at it, and then you will succeed.
Totally agree. And I think that's a really good point, that if I know that there's people that do see a niche that's not being filled, or they have an idea that's never been done before, if that's you, you should 10 times more do it, because that is where we really get you'll have more potential there, because you can like do something that's never been done before potentially.
Yeah.
And I would put you and Isabella in that category. You two are really the first ones I think of when I think of this short form content. So super cool to have that there. Really, really great. Or you could put a sock puppet on your hand and rant about the Fed.
Exactly.
But
But yeah, you've got to find it out. It's really, I find that's the hardest part, honestly, because some people don't know if the market just wants them to be them or if they should be another person. I feel that the market has signaled to me that I can't just be plain old Julian. I don't think that there's any demand for that out there, but there is demand for me to experiment and try these other things that other people can't do with their, creative talents. So that's my thing. I'm not like just a genuinely good conversationalist, let's just say.
that's a good point, actually, because I'm different. Like for me, I feel like I can completely be myself on this, because I'm not the star of the show. I bring guests on. I want them to be the focus, so it's okay if I'm boring and just myself. But when you're doing short form in that world, you need to be a little more punchy, a little more, you have to hit more emotions to keep people hooked in to get the content out there.
But I think also to be a good podcast host like yourself, you have to be a really good listener. And I will like admit, like I'm not a great listener. I used to interview people and I would try and I just, the conversations would just not flow as well. I listen to people like Peter McCormack and other podcasters, and I'd be thinking, these guys don't prep any questions and they just have this great flowing conversation. It's because he's dialed in. He's listening to every single word the person is saying. He's done like a little bit of research on them ahead of time. But I just don't quite have that natural talent. It would be a very conscious effort of mine to like lock in and pay attention to people's words. But I'm just one of those types of people where my brain is always like somewhere else, thinking of other things. When I say words, I think, oh, that might be a short idea or something. I just, it's hard, and I'm just not built to be a podcast host. But I think the only qualification for it, honestly, is that you're a really good listener. And if you are parsing out what people are saying, you're hearing the subtext, the context, and all that stuff, and you're able to dig deeper into things, then you'll excel. Like, look at Lex Friedman. That guy is so fucking boring to listen to. He is so monotone and dry, but he's a fantastic listener. He pays attention to every single beat, and he picks the right rabbit holes to go down, and he doesn't get distracted. Everything that his questions are just like immaculately formed, and he can do that with everyone. But you would never guess, meeting that guy in public, that he has this gigantic podcast.
And that's such a great point. There are just so many different types of brains out there, and there's no good or bad kind. And we mentioned earlier, we talked about, we both spent time with Peruvian Bull. He and I traveled in Colombia for like 6 months out of the last couple of years. So I spent a lot of time with him, and I really learned from spending time with him, just like total contrasting brain types. Like him and I are so different. I am a complete generalist. I'm bouncing all over the place, looking at things all the time, sort of just skimming most things and just getting the important pieces. And he has extremely good memory and detail retention, which I don't have. Like that's one of my downsides, is I'm really bad at remembering details. I had to look up when the Fed was founded earlier. I didn't just remember that 1913. Dates are an example. I can't remember dates to save my life, but if you asked him any date for like any, bank thing that happened, he'll remember it. And it's just, people need to understand that there are these very different, skills that our brains have. And if you can just start a list, start the things that you know about yourself and write down, we've given a lot of good ideas here. I think, what type of brain do you have? What are you good at? What do you enjoy doing? What niches are out there that you think you could fit into? What sort of content do you think needs to be made? Just where do you fit into all this is basically a good thing to be thinking about. And that's, as you and I both on the final year here of our 20s, I think we can agree that that's really what the 20s are about for a lot of people, is figuring out where you fit into the world. But I'm excited for the younger folks out there who are finding this stuff and dialing in, because you can figure it out earlier. You don't have to be 30 and kind of finally starting to figure things out like us. You can do it much earlier. And there's all sorts of different educational rabbit holes you can go down as well for, homeschooling. Maybe that's the key for getting more kids like on a faster track to figuring things out. I'm not sure if you've researched that much, but
I was
that's one I'd
homeschooled
love
for a
to check
couple of
out.
years. So yeah.
You're what?
I was homeschooled for a couple of years.
So what are your thoughts on the different educational tracks out there? That's something interesting I'd like to hear from someone who's done both of them.
I mean, I was an only child growing up, so my social skills are not perfectly adept.
Me
but
too.
I think homeschooling works very well for only children. I think we benefit from it because maybe we're naturally not as socially inclined. We don't feel that like emptiness if we don't have a sibling around. You have to learn to adapt anyways. But I think, look, I think education is one of those things that it's so cheap to become a genius now. It's never been easier to fill your brain with so much knowledge on things. And it's insane that we have these institutions that are just like, they're just so reluctant to use any of these tools. Honestly, I was saying, like, one of the reasons people don't do homeschooling is because of their perception of the cost. Like, the cost is way too inhibitive to create this whole curriculum. And then eventually, you do have to send your kid to do provincials to get a proper diploma to get into college. Like, they're never going to get rid of that system. So if you still want to do that track, then your homeschooling can only go up to a certain point. But I keep thinking now with all these, AIs and GPTs, like, the cost to have a personalized tutor, like, that's the ideal situation, is every single student has a personalized tutor that somehow connects to a little bit of a generalized curriculum. I think the generalization of curriculums has to be a lot less stringent, and it has to be, have a lot more subjectivity to it, rather than like, here's multiple choice answers, remember this fact, remember that fact. Like, it has to be, when we have, SATs and general tests, they should be about your ability to write. And we can set, we can set rubrics on what is a good essay and what's not. Was it persuasive, what's not. We can come up with scores. AI can score this stuff, for God's sake, right? So we have to have some general like syllabus to grade how people, work and are able to process their thoughts. But beyond that, like, the cost to have a personalized education is freaking zero these days now. And I just, like, people just need to be made more aware of that. I think it's going to change dramatically, but I mean, I could just dive into this. Like, you look at Tesla's. Did you see Tesla's thing last night with the Cybertrucks and the Optimus robots?
I saw some robot clips. I didn't look any deeper into it.
The speech comprehension and the back and forth is fantastic. It's like you're talking to a human. It doesn't feel like you're talking to a robot. They're super kitschy and kind of quirky, and just the natural speech synthesis is just amazing. So what the future is going to look like to me, if we decide to not be, slaves to the state, if we actually embrace technologies and stop running away from them, the future of education is either those robots are going to get cheap enough for every household to have one, higher, lower, or middle class, or you're going to pool money into one of those things. You're going to be able to download, the GPT that, is a great teacher, the best teacher, like Michael Saylor says. We don't need a billion or a million math teachers. We just need to have the best one in the world teach everyone. It's like, well, we've had all this digital stuff where you kind of have to manually force yourself through it on a screen, but people don't like that. What's going to happen with these robots is they're going to be able to be the instructors in these hands-on ways because they physically have hands. And every single student in a developed country will be able to learn from one of these robots, and it'll be perfect and they'll love it. right? They'll love it. These robots can be made to be human-like, they can be funny, they can be interactive, they can cater to your needs. And I don't know how public education is going to stand a chance without them basically, trying to stop these robots, which we know that they'll do. They'll try and stop this decentralized education. But I think they're going to fail very quickly, because you're going to just see small people in these communities, whether it's in your church group or your work, that'll have a child who's just crushing it at math. And they'll talk to the parent that has their kid going to like the chalkboard school, and they'll be like, wait, we're paying like the same amount, or you're paying basically nothing to have this robot teach your kid, and your kid's crushing it. Like, why am I sending it to public school? They're going to have to force the kids to go to public school. They passed laws like that in the States when they created public education back in like the 20s or whatever with the Rockefellers, that it was mandatory. You have to send your kids to school. And they did that because they foresaw that, well, eventually, like, this is a state-run system. It's probably going to be anarchic, and people are going to want to opt out or teach their own kids. We have to make it mandatory. You're going to see more and more crackdowns on homeschooling, but eventually the free market will win. Rant over.
Yeah, and that's something I just learned like within the last year, is that some places homeschooling is illegal. Like Germany is one that I remember off the top of my head. You can't homeschool in Germany. I didn't know that.
Be extremely skeptical of any society that would somehow tell you it should be illegal to parent and educate your own children. Like, it shocks me that doesn't wake more people up to the state's level of tyranny.
Absolutely agree. That's crazy. Is Canada like that at all, or is there, I haven't done much research on which countries do and which don't. But I mean, where did I actually was going to ask you about Canada in general. I think it'd be interesting to just get sort of your take on where the country's at right now, because I don't know if you know about the homeschooling side of things, but just Canada in general just keeps popping up in the news with all these interesting stuff. We had the trucker protests. We have, all sorts of just weird laws coming around, and it seems like things are going in a not what Bitcoiners would like, let's say, direction.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on all of that?
The housing bubble has to pop for us to have any sort of change here. Like, that has to, like, we've just had no punishment for our reckless gambling, and that's why no side is going to fix that issue, right? Like, everyone's putting all their bets on Pierre Poilievre. He's the conservative guy, I guess our version of Republican, but I mean, the conservatives in Canada are basically like the Democrats in the US in terms of, political spectrum alignment. Like, they're pretty lefty on most things. And that's the best that we have, right? Like, we don't have any libertarian. I mean, our country has just been able to skate on by on being relatively middle class when the US hasn't. But that's breaking down in a huge way, because in the last 10 years, basically since Trudeau got in, we had a pretty similar track where US productivity gains and wages tracked housing prices like pretty neatly. Now they're starting to diverge a little bit in the US, but that gap in Canada and Australia is just obscene. And the only way that they've been able to kind of paper over it is by allowing immigration in. And that's sort of like pepper GDP a little bit. But you look at GDP and you take away public sector jobs from that, and it's down. It's down. Like, we're way less, we're creating much less stuff than we were in 2014. But you don't see it because all the productive gains have gone into the housing market. That bubble will pop. That bubble will pop eventually. I don't know what the catalyst is to it, but when it does, everybody will be like, hold on. The conservatives, the liberals, the NDP, all the social parties, they all let us down this stupid rabbit hole of storing all our freaking wealth in houses. What a mistake that is. We need to get a whole new breath of fresh air in. So if you can get away from the nihilism of that whole situation eventually unfolding, and again, it could go on for another 20, 30 years. I have no idea how long they can keep this housing thing going. Eventually, when it does pop, though, there will be an awakening in Canada. And I think you'll see a lot of things come out of that awakening. I think you'll see a lot of provinces start to split off. There's a very big lack of alignment as to what a Canadian is. Americans talk about Texas seceding and stuff, but you go from Washington to Florida, you kind of feel like you're still in America. Doesn't feel like that in Canada. You go from like Alberta, Calgary over to Toronto, the mindsets of the people are so different. And this idea that there's a shared Canadian identity doesn't exist, because we never went through a process of creating a constitution. We were gifted this country because the British didn't want to pay for it anymore. The Americans, this is like the big fundamental difference between Americans and Canadians. You guys had to fight like hell to get your independence. And that fight, that struggle is enshrined in your constitution. And that is what keeps a lot of you guys like grounded, and it keeps a lot of you guys principled. We never had that. We were just gifted this country because it was too expensive. And I know that the French, have some history of fighting for it, but you look at the place where they have the most identity in this country, it's in Quebec, because they had to fight for their piece of land in this country like hell. And they protected it. And there's so much patriotism for, Quebecers. But I mean, British Columbians, Albertans, Ontarians, like we didn't have to fight. There's no history of that. And so that's why we eat all this, nonsense up about, white guilt and melting pots and all this crap. So we don't know what we actually stand for. We have no principles. A whole new level of principles will be built on the back of that bubble popping. We will have an awakening moment here in this country. It's going to be 100 years before I think that transition, finally coalesces, because that bubble popping is going to be, I think when the Canadian housing bubble truly pops, my prediction is that we will have the West and Canada will have one of the largest social uprisings that North America has ever had, more than Mexico fighting for its independence, more than some of the uprisings in the US. When that bubble finally pops in Canada, there will be complete anarchy and rebuilding of how our society works. And it'll be for the better, but it will take a long time to play out.
Yeah, I love throwing that scary A word out there just to see what people think, the anarchy word, because we're super conditioned to think that just means bad. That's scary. It's chaos. It's everything's bad about it and negative in our brain, but really, it's just natural. It's the most like closest we can get to just being natural, like human being individuals. Everyone gets to do whatever they want. And we've never seen that before in our lifetime for sure. And they'll point at certain cases around the world where, oh, like this is anarchy. No, it never was. Like it wasn't actually anarchy. And it's so that'll be something that's interesting to research more on, because like you said earlier, libertarians very often are good at complaining, not good at coming up with solutions. And so many people that just go down a libertarian rabbit hole just end up at anarchy actually being the best. Who I haven't really figured out for myself yet, to be honest. I'm still sort of learning about that. That's one of the reasons why I have a podcast. I want to learn about this from people. I learn these different cases, hear like what are the pros and cons of the system, because it's quite a complex issue to get into. Like, what is the best structure for society? That's a huge question, and there's so many different opinions to be had. And I think that the fact that we have decentralized information to tackle this is amazing. It's great that we have like individual, content creators out there. They're all sort of diving through this together separately. It's exciting. And I'm with you that I think that this is going to be for the better. In Jeff Booth, another Canadian, a legend, he talks about this a lot, how, we need to think about like what is this transition going to be like when we go from fiat to Bitcoin, because there is going to be some very, very big losers and some big winners, but there's going to be just a lot of shit show everywhere, probably, unless we do things very carefully, which I don't know if it's possible. What do you think about that?
Well, really quick, I want to get back to that question, but I just had a thought here. If you think of the most successful countries on earth by, let's just say, GDP and happiness and, size of population productivity, they all kind of hit three boxes. One, they had to escape the tyrannical rule of another country or a civilization, right? There was an actual, revolution to move away from another country's dominance over it. Two, they had to have a massive, massive civil war. And then three, they had to go through some joint, struggle together as a nation to kind of prosper on the other side, whether it was like a crazy depression or massive hyperinflation or something. So think of those three criteria. Think of Germany, right? How Germany formed, the massive civil war, the massive price that they paid, right? Think of Japan, think of China, think of India. All these countries hit all those three boxes of just pain and turmoil to find out what those people truly stood for and what really shaped those people. Canada never did that. Canada was gifted. We've had a little, you could argue that we've been through some, turmoil domestically, but we never really had a civil war in this country. And I don't want to say that it's a prerequisite to go through that level, an immense amount of pain to succeed as a country. But I think you certainly need that level of pain to understand what your true identity is as a nation. And I think without Canada understanding its true identity, I don't think that we can ever really reach our full potential. I think the only way for a country to reach its potential is to understand what they stand for. And the only way to understand what you stand for is to go through a lot of pain to get there. So I'll lock that.
Yeah.
Can you rephrase your question about Jeff Booth? I want to get back to that.
Oh yeah, sorry. And let me quickly respond to that. I just think it'll be interesting to see if a bunch of little conflicts and little, awakening moments like the trucker protest, for example, if there are enough of those little things that sort of, give people an identity and something to fight for and a vision for the future, I wonder if that will suffice, without having to have one of those extremely damaging things. We'll have to wait and see.
I'll have to see.
And yeah, the Jeff Booth question, I was basically saying one of the things that he talks about a lot is what is this transition going to be like from, fiat to Bitcoin? And it's been a while since I really dove deep into his content, but if I remember correctly, he basically makes the case that it doesn't have to be catastrophically volatile and chaos everywhere as we make that transition if we do it carefully. I don't know if I agree with that. Part of me just thinks it's inevitable there's going to be just chaos because like the central banking system, the fiat governments everywhere with unlimited power. We're going from these, cantillionaire, infinite money printing, ultimate power, and switching to Bitcoin where no one can print, no one can create money. How do you see that transition going on either a national or a global level, just for humanity?
The more power and influence that the state has over the citizens' day-to-day lives, the harder the transition to a Bitcoin standard will be. And I think it just boils down to that. I don't think El Salvador is anywhere close to living on a Bitcoin standard, but I think it was pretty easy for them to just make the Bitcoin law, right? Like, and they just had a leader that just understood it at the time. And so like, they're not going to have a violent transition to Bitcoin. They've already got like the pieces. I think over the next few years, you're going to find that basically you just have to look at the countries where the state is the least intrusive, and they'll be the first ones to pick up Bitcoin as their standard. And then as eventually the dominoes fall, you'll have one big, state superpower, one of the G20 nations where the state is very active in their citizens' lives. One of those nations will eventually cave, and then they will look to those nations, those smaller ones, for the blueprint on how to bring in the Bitcoin standard. I think it just really depends on where you are. Like most of the population that exists on Earth are generally in nations where the state has like a pretty heavy hand in things. I've been wanting to study India a lot more because they have a really massive population. They send out a lot of people. There's a lot of immigrants out of India that kind of shape a lot of places around the world. They're very capitalistic in India. Like they're very big free market people, and there's this hell of a hustle entrepreneur spirit across India, but the state still has a lot of power with like the case system and, regulations and things there. But I think the damage will be, the struggle will be dictated by those gigantic nations and what their transitions look like. If I was to guess, I would say that India's path to a Bitcoin standard will be a lot easier than America's path to a Bitcoin standard. I think they're way more willing to experiment with not having a rupee there than we're willing to not have a US dollar, over here. So
they also have a lot more gold in their zeitgeist. So another chance to throw that word out there.
Exactly. They understand the value of that gold
system.
Too, right?
Yeah, like every family in India. I mean, I haven't talked to a lot of Indians about this actually, so I probably shouldn't say that until I really like dig into that. But I know that holding gold is a huge part of their culture, where it isn't in North America anymore. That's long gone.
What I'm curious about is, I think that I don't like this whole idea of globalization. I don't like this idea that every single country should be a melting pot. I think it destroys culture. So in some way, and I know this is going to sound weird to a lot of people, I still want there to be countries with, dictators or sort of like uniparty rule. And maybe that's not like the best thing for those citizens. But I think it offers color to our world. And if all of us are kind of the same, then we don't really have a much of anything, honestly. Like, and it's easier for us to be controlled as a planet if all of our systems are the same. So I like going to places, I don't want to say El Salvador is like a dictatorship or anything, but it's pretty clear like they picked one path, and democracy is like, well, why bother down there, right? Because it's Bukele, right? But there are some places like, Dubai, in the Emirates where they don't really have, super functional elections or democracies, but the standard of living, the happiness of the people is so high. And they don't allow in immigrants in places like China or Japan that easily. But the standard of living and again, the people are super happy. So what I kind of hope is that, and what I wonder about Bitcoin is how it fits into all these different cultures. And even though it's this kind of like global entity and global asset, can it allow room for, homogenous societies to stay homogenous? Because I really hope they do. Like, I was just in Japan. I don't want, Japan to get overrun with foreigners, and have them, pop up McDonald's and all these other things in that country and kind of ruin and cover up their culture. Like, I love that they have, buildings in areas where the real estate is worth millions that are from, 2000 years ago. And I love that they're not going down and taking down their statues of samurais who are, genocidal maniacs. Right. Like, I love that they embrace that history rather than run away from it. I don't want every freaking civilization on earth to be like Canada and America. So I really wonder how Bitcoin plays a role in that. Like, I think everybody's approach to Bitcoin will be different. They'll see it as a different tool or a different function. For us in the West, we look at Bitcoin as this tool for liberty and freedom. And it's like, if you find out about Bitcoin, you'll become a sovereign individual. But maybe that's not the way that some of these other countries look at it. Like, it's like, okay, we can bring Bitcoin into Japan, but it's not going to automatically turn everyone into a libertarian. Maybe they can keep having their, social democracy there and their more like leftist view of things and still embrace, Bitcoin for what it is. That's why I'm still really interested when people are, like the Progressive Bitcoiner podcast, when they want to bring these other political ideologies and still make it compatible with Bitcoin. I think Bitcoin definitely does promote freedom values above everything else, but I don't want to live in a world where everyone's a libertarian, man. Like, it'd be nuts. Like, I kind of love going to these places where there's order and everybody kind of wears the same thing. Like, I wouldn't live there, but I love exploring those things. I think we can learn a lot from those cultures and have diverse conversations about it. That's the one worry I have about Bitcoiners, honestly, is that we're very dogmatic about how the world should be. And like, you go to a Bitcoin meetup and everyone's just eating steak and, wearing cheap shit because they're waiting for the price of Bitcoin to go up. And it's just like, it's kind of boring, man. Like, I love Bitcoin, but the Bitcoiners that intrigue me the most are the ones that don't fit in with the Bitcoiner culture, which is getting to be a little bit one track. I don't like that I go somewhere and I agree with everyone in the room on something. I gotta find people I disagree with on things.
I
That's
will
what
fight
makes
you on the steak, bro. Every human should be eating steak. I think that that's the healthiest human diet. Maybe if we are all eating a proper diet of just steak, then people will fully embrace their real selves and not, get mushed around like you're talking about.
Bro, they put like an insane amount of biodiversity on the planet for a reason. We should be eating the grains and the beans and the fruits and the vegetables
Oh,
and
you're
all that
killing me.
shit.
Oh,
They wouldn't make it so easy to grow. And also have fun having a steak in freaking Dubai, man. Those cows are gonna roast out in the sun. It's impossible. You gotta adapt. Go to the islands, man. I want to do a documentary on Bitcoin adoption on this little island called Tuvalu. It's a sovereign nation, but the country is
that sounds like a Nickelodeon TV show. Is that an actual
Tuvalu.
place?
Yeah, Tuvalu. Okay, I'll give you like the lowdown on the Tuvalu thing, and then if anyone's listening, I want to crowdfund this. I know exactly how much it'll take to do this. Tuvalu is the world's smallest country. It was granted independence, I think, from Australia or the UK in the 1970s. And it's an island of about 12,000 people, but it is its own country. The GDP of the country is $53 million. So it's like the GDP is one of Sailor's like, birthday bashes or something. And the island is maybe about 500 meters wide. And the highest point of the island is only 6 meters above the sea level. And you can walk from tip to tip to the country in, a couple hours, right? And there's a couple of other atolls or islands nearby. And so I thought, well, when you're in Bitcoin, you have to start small. We're not going to orange pill, the president in the US, although it's getting close. Smaller nations, you can probably enact and move legislation through quicker. And so how fun would it be to go to the world's smallest country and see if I could orange pill them there in a week, maybe bring some other more influential and better speakers with me and see how quickly they could pass a law. Because I'm sure their bureaucracy can't be that bad. There's only 13,000 people on the whole freaking island, and they have independence. But I researched more about that country, and I was thinking, oh man, like if I go there, like where am I going to eat? Like I want to have a steak, right? Nope, no way. If you want to import beef, go for it. There's no freaking cows on that island, you know? Like they have chickens and they have fish. And in terms of vegetables, there's a couple little things like coconuts, but that's what they eat there. They eat just a hearty diet of fish. So this idea that like every Bitcoiner is going to be like steak eating maxi and steak's the only way. It's like tell that to someone who lives in fucking Tuvalu, right? They're going to import their beef by cargo plane, you know? It's crazy. There's a lot of like superfoods out there. I don't think steak's the only one. That's my rant.
Yeah, ground beef is another one, and also butter and yeah, just
I don't know,
steak and
dude.
ground
People
beef.
can live off fish. Look at the Japanese, right?
Yeah, no, there's definitely different cultures out there that have different ones, but the question is, what is optimal? I would
Yeah.
argue that those people are certainly living on that, but I would say that's a problem to be solved, not something to just say it's like it's perfect. Like there's got to be some way that with all this technology we have, all the supply chains we have, that we can, even the small places like that could, have a system where they can get all of these choices in, and that's why I think once we actually see real capitalism, then maybe that'll happen. Who knows? But it's tough. I don't know anything about that country, so I can't speak much more on it. But it sounds like maybe a similar playbook as Madeira would be like a good idea to try to get them. I'm not even sure where that one is right now, like where their track is, but I know that they brought like a really great team of Bitcoiners in there. They talked to the prime minister, the president, and it sounds like things are going great. So I feel like we should have sort of a Bitcoiner Navy SEAL team that just goes around and just orange pills all these small countries. I know that there are people working on that, but it's exciting to watch. Are there any other places? Because you do a lot of traveling too, and you really look at these things with an eye for the story. Maybe we can just start wrapping things up here with just what are some stories that you think are out there that more people need to be aware of, and maybe things that you're looking at, you're curious about that are happening in the world right now of Bitcoin that people don't know.
What's that country near Tibet that's been mining a bunch of Bitcoin with hydro? Bhutan?
Oh yeah, they just bought a bunch, didn't they? I
Well,
saw
they're
that in the
mining
news.
it like crazy with all their
Yeah.
hydropower, and they're kind of doing it
Okay.
stealthily. So that's one I'm really interested in telling. It's a pretty hard country to get a visa to. But yeah, how does this small nation is now taking full advantage of all their excess hydropower, and they're all in on Bitcoin, and now they're one of the biggest government holders of it, even though it's a really tiny country. I think that's a super intriguing story. Um, I Here's the thing: when you're making documentaries, you can either be the passive storyteller, you're telling history of something, you're interviewing locals, and then you're not in it yourself. You can be a more active storyteller where you're in there and the exploration of a place is from your perspective, which I really like doing. But I've also had a couple ideas for documentaries, or maybe just call them videos, where not only am I in them, not only is the crew of people we know in them and they're telling the story, but we're actively creating the story. So like Isabella's show, for example, like it's not about a circular economy she's visiting. It's like she's creating it every single week, and you get to see that, and it's super active. And it's like she's the protagonist, and you get to go on that journey with her, not just exploring a place, but making it happen. People love that stuff. It's like way more interactive. And I've had a few ideas of places that I've wanted to go to do more experiments to see, could I bring a circular economy in here? I think with enough, capital and time, anything is really possible on that angle. So those are things I've been more wanting to explore. But I definitely have been curious about exploring Bitcoin again, like we talked about, through lenses of places where, sovereignty, personal sovereignty, and me is sort of like not the MO. Japan is really interesting in that. They're very collectivist in a lot of their values, but I wouldn't say that they don't have freedom. And I think that's another theme I want to explore too. Is like just because you believe in like collectivist values does not mean that you're a slave to a state. It means that you can have a ton of free time. And so we look down at some of these places that are socialist, right? Like, Denmark and Sweden and Finland, like, oh yeah, they're so socialist there. It's like, cool, those guys have way more time to enjoy their families. Their birth rates are decent, and they're super, like, they're eating super well, and they have socialism. So what gives, right? Maybe it's not just a 1-for-1 equivalency. More freedom of government doesn't mean, healthier people necessarily. So there's a lot of things there. I've had a lot of fun, honestly, recently, like just challenging some Bitcoiners on things. And I think you can only really do that when you travel and see how the other side of the world works, because so much of it is just like Western hemisphere concentrated. All the development, all that stuff is just, we have our ways of doing things. And we think that there's like one prescription everything, and that's the orange pill. And I just think that there's just so much more to it. And we could utilize a lot of that education and info to change how we present Bitcoin,
I love it. And I'm the same way. I love traveling, just going, getting on the ground, seeing things in person. And it really just changes your whole view. And this is why I always recommend people do more traveling if you can, especially if you're just young and single. Like, you're eventually, I don't know about you, but I certainly will be wanting to settle down and build a family someday. So I want to get this out of the way now. And there are certainly travel families out there. Some people continue traveling while building a family, but just see the world. There's so much out there. There's so much cool stuff to see. And so many stories to be told. And I'm looking forward to continuing to watch your documentaries you make about this stuff. You and Max DeMarco are like my two Bitcoin movie guys. You guys are killing it out there, and I really appreciate the work you're doing. And where can people follow you, Julian, to go see your future work and the stuff you're working on?
Yeah, you can go look us up on YouTube. That's where all the long form and short form stuff lives. That's youtube.com/@getbasedtv, based BASED, getbasedtv. And then I think same on Twitter, getbasedtv on Twitter as well is where we post all our stuff. So GetBased is a collective of me, Isabel Santos, and Adam O'Brien, who also runs one of Canada's larger Bitcoin exchanges. So yeah.
Excellent, man. I'm looking forward to seeing more from you, and for everyone to go check you out. Thank you so much for joining me today. We had some great new perspectives I have not had on the show yet, so I really appreciate your time, and I look forward to keeping in touch, my friend.
Thanks for having me, Ben. You got to come up here to Vancouver. We got these killer meetups.
Yeah, I'm coming back to Seattle area for the holidays. I'm going back to visit family for Christmas, so maybe I could make a trip up there.
Yeah, you come with Peruvian up here. Be dope.
Yeah, we could carpool up, and we could try to find Ian too. I know Ian Carroll lives.
Yeah.
We figured out all three of us live super close together, and we all kicked it on New Year's last year. So I think Ian's trying to move right now. I haven't really chatted with him in a little while, but it would be really cool to come up to Canada. I would love to see Vancouver. I know that Vivian's up there too, and I've been meaning to visit her too. I got her to come down to Whidbey Island, where I'm from, which is super nice. You should visit Whidbey if you're ever.
I've been there. I love Whidbey Island. That's like the epic bridge, right? That crosses over. I love that. Yeah.
That's my rock, dude. That's where I grew up.
Yeah, the drive-in movie theater. We've been to the drive-in movie theater there a couple times.
Yes.
Yeah.
That is my spot. I'm so glad you've been there.
Mm-hmm.
That's amazing. It's a beautiful part of the world, and I can definitely say that I am in the vein of, I want to not run away from my home. I want to like fix my home and fix this like part of the world that have had all these weird issues going on, the political problems, there's homelessness everywhere in Seattle. Seattle's in rough shape right now, but I'm hopeful Bitcoin will fix it. We will come together. We will get good people to fix it and continue making positive moves for our homeland. I'm optimistic.
Yeah, dude, we're all Satoshi, and we're all the heroes of this story, and it's just going to take some time, but we will win. We'll be victorious. I'm confident of it.
Amen to that, man. Appreciate you, dude. Talk to you later.